Wissam Boustany, it's a real pleasure to be talking with you. Thank you for joining me from London.
Hi, nice to see you again.
You too. This is the fourth interview in my series of interviews, and the first question has always been to ask about your musical background. And for example, where were you born and how did you start learning music?
Okay, so I'm Lebanese. I was born in Beirut in Lebanon. And how did I start music? I suppose the journey started, first of all, my parents tell me a story that when I was about 3-4 years old, they used to put Beethoven string quartets on recordings. And I used to go, and they thought, oh my God, our son is not musical, he hates music. But actually looking back, maybe I was really reacting to the music. I was reacting to the dissonances and which in a way, maybe it was the first sign that I was highly sensitized to it. And then moving on, when I was about 8 years old, my parents took me to an oboe recital at the American University of Beirut in the alumni club. They used to have like a series of recitals, and they took me. And I'd never seen an oboe before. And this man with a kind of professor beard stood up, picked up the instrument, and suddenly his face puffed up, all red, and this incredible sound came out. And again, my parents tell me that I was crying. I want to play the oboe. I want to play the oboe. I think that's when the seed of playing a wind instrument was born. They told me, look, you're too young to play the oboe. There's not a lot written for the instrument. Be patient until your body grows a bit. Then I learned the piano for 6 months when I was about 10, 11. I hated that. And then I got a flute for my birthday, on my 12th birthday.
Right.
And I'd never seen actually a flute before. I opened the box and there it was.
Wow.
The first thing I did is I took it up. I tried to blow it. I couldn't get the sound out. And I tried again the next day. So then I got a screwdriver and I undid all the mechanism. And it took me a week to put it back together again. So that's how I started. And then very quick, after that, I got into the conservatoire. And really, by the time I was 14, I was absolutely into music because I had been shit at school, very, very, I didn't have the discipline to keep up with homework and exams. And whenever I picked up the flute, I felt that people respected me. And once my teachers at school knew this, they just let me do what I wanted to do. I stopped being a nuisance at school and a troublemaker, and I kind of found what I needed to do. But unfortunately, that's when the war started in Lebanon. So as I was pushing into my flute, schools were shutting down and everything was collapsing. So we wound up at home practicing. My stepfather was a violinist, and he taught us. So that's kind of quick.
So this was around 1975?
Yeah, so I was 15 by then. But really, things deteriorated after 1973. That's when the massacres were happening, the things were closing down. We'd have like a week of school, and then school. Things were 85. So those years between 1973 to 1975 was where the flute became my focal point. And I got like hopelessly out of touch with academics really by then.
Right.
And then they sent me, when I was 17, they said, enough, you've got to go study abroad. And I came to Cheetham School of Music in Manchester as a boarding student.
Right.
And suddenly I was surrounded by 200 super motivated musicians, very classical. But it was great to be with like-minded musicians and to be able to push into my flute playing. And,
So what is it that you love about the flute now, as you look back on it?
Well, if you go back to why I fell in love with the oboe that first time, it grabbed me by my insides. He took a breath in, and then when he started to blow, something enormous came out. And that is why I've always been fascinated by the fact that you can't see air, it's invisible. You take it into your lungs and you mix it with your imagination and your passions. And what comes out are emotional structures that can actually change lives, can actually motivate people to change as people. And I've never lost that sense of the miracle, transforming invisible air into palpable sound. It just blows my mind every time I think about it. And if I forget that, I'm not really in touch with my playing.
Right. When did you first experience improvisation?
Much later. I went through school, A-levels, went to college. By then, my teacher, Trevor Y., in some classes, he would say, "Oh, you've got to learn how to improvise." So he'd make us sit in a kind of circle, and he'd play some kind of riff or chord sequence, and we'd take turns improvising. But I hated that. I really could not connect with that. And then I kind of put that on hold. I graduated from college, and 2 years, 3 years after I graduated, I was approaching a kind of a bottleneck, a kind of barrier in my playing, where I felt that I was practicing all my technical studies and working on my sound, working on my scales, practicing my pieces. But whenever I played, I was in a pattern that I couldn't break. I would be frustrated. I'd be forcing the sound. There was something not adding up in my playing. So I decided one day on my own, tomorrow morning, I'm not going to do my scales. I'm not going to do my warm-ups. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to put the flute together and I'm just going to improvise for 10 minutes. Whatever happens, I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to play for 10 minutes.
How did you have this idea?
I don't remember. It was a need. It felt like the technical structures or methods that I'd been taught in, I didn't believe in them anymore, and I needed to change. And the one thing that I was never doing was playing by ear.
Right.
So by then I had started memorizing, and that was a big step. So that was a very strong hurdle to confront the fear of memorizing and performing from memory. But then when I started to improvise, that was another big step to take. You know, when you jump into the unknown and you don't know how you're going to come out of it the other side, that's when you're really testing your beliefs. So I picked up my flute that morning. I didn't even warm up. I didn't blow to no. I just went straight into an improvisation. All I said was start, evolve, and end. And those 10 minutes completely changed my life.
Wow.
And it happened on my own.
Was improvisation in the air? I mean, did Trevor Y improvise? Did you hear him play?
Yeah, a few little kind of cliche jazz, blues riffs. You see, I think that a big restriction of why people don't necessarily feel comfortable starting improvising is that we introduce the chords and the styles prematurely. I think it's much more constructive. The biggest is, you see, if I'm teaching someone or trying to motivate someone to learn to memorize, for instance, or to improvise, the elephant in the room is not memorizing or improvising. The elephant in the room is fear. Fear of failure. What do I do if I can't? And that's what stops us from trying. And when we don't try, we don't discover what we're capable of or not capable of. So the enemy is not memory or improvisation. The enemy is the fear of the unknown. Because we don't know it, we want to protect our self-esteem by running away from it and pretending it's not there. So, and frankly, dealing with fear is more important than improvising or memorizing. Because fear is, as far as I'm concerned, what paralyzes us as people in life. It stops us from being the people we want to be. So dealing with fear is absolutely fundamental for our development as human beings and our self-esteem and a feeling that we can deal with the issues that life throws at us. And then you start to see improvising or memorizing or any other challenge as just like a study to learn how to deal with fear. And really after that, fear becomes your friend, becomes your teacher, becomes your motivator, and it makes you practice a damn sight harder as well.
Right.
So there are, of course, negative aspects to fear, and fear in itself is a negative energy. But in learning to look at the challenge and understand why the fear is there, your relationship with it, the process of overcoming it makes you a better person. And when you become a better person, you become a better musician. The two are hand in hand. But this way around is more fertile ground for growth than if you just fix the flute player, put bandages on all the issues that you're trying to fix, but never really deal with your inner motivations and what makes you scared, how you overcome that. Because that keeps coming back. It's the elephant in the room that we try to pretend is not there. But actually, if you look at it straight on, you start to understand the nature of your limits, which are most often self-imposed. We think it's the exam system. We think it's the politics. We think it's the teacher. No. You start to realize it boils down to me personally understanding the issue I'm surrounded by. So you start to become your own teacher, I think.
I mean, if you've been told you're talented, I imagine you associate your playing, good as it is at the moment, with your own worth. I mean, it becomes very hard to grow because you risk losing what you've already got. And maybe it's just safer to hold on to what you have than to move into new territory.
That's beautiful. I think there are two concepts that are very, very important in music. The concept of consolidation and the concept of taking risks. And they're kind of opposites, but they're born out of the same issues. So a part of us needs to consolidate what we know we do well, consolidate our practice, consolidate the piece to the point where you not just know it, you really, really, really know it. Okay? The consolidation gives you confidence. It gives you stability and power and a balance and the ability to play around the field and aim and push the limits of your sound. But equally, if you rely too much on consolidation, you become fearful of taking risks. So it's very important to keep taking risks, because when you throw everything up in the air and you see what comes back and you learn to deal with it, then you've got the best of both worlds, the benefit of consolidation and the ability to deal with a situation that could fall on its face, or you can save and make it the most beautiful moment of your life. And improvisation belongs in that part more. Although both, it's a bit too dangerous to talk about improvisation as a stereotype of taking risks, because there's a lot of memory involved in improvisation. And there's a lot of improvisation and inner ear listening involved in memory. And so the two kind of they share some DNA, but they're kind of aiming for different things. So for me, I always describe if I, as a human being, stand on two legs, one leg I stand on is memory, and the other leg I stand on is improvisation. And with those two legs, I have pretty much the stability I need in terms of technique, in terms of imagination, consolidation, taking risks, playing by ear, knowing what my body needs to do at any given time. I've got everything represented in those two disciplines, memory and improvisation. So I don't practice studies. I don't practice scales on their own. I'm constantly either memorizing something or I'm improvising something. And one place I can't stand is that no man's land in between the two, where you're neither memorized nor are you free. It's like you've got the worst of all worlds. So either I believe in performing from memory, or I prefer to improvise. I don't like to perform staring at a piece of music. So I've kind of I've made clear boundaries in my mind, what I expect from myself. And it's simplified because I don't need to decide every time I perform, shall I memorize? Am I going to be able to memorize? I'll wait until, no, I know I'm going to do it. I don't give myself an option. Just like I stopped smoking, just like I stopped drinking, you don't give yourself the option to fail. You just go for it.
Right.
And it becomes a habit.
So talking about playing a piece from memory and improvising, what are the differences between those two states for you?
Well, I mean, look, when you memorize, you make mistakes. What do you do when you make a mistake? You improvise until you can find your way back into the piece. So otherwise, you as soon as you can't remember what's coming next, you just stop. Well, if you stop, then the performance is stopped. So there are, once the memory is there, and then given that we're human and we make mistakes, it's very important to learn how to absorb the mistakes that happen along the way and keep playing and make something up. It might be two notes. I've had a memory lapse of 20 bars once. I kept playing and very few people noticed.
But apart from wrong notes, I mean, imagine you play a piece wonderfully from memory and you improvise. What differences do you sense inside, if any? Maybe it feels the same.
Well, I believe that if you look at life, nothing ever repeats itself. Ever. Never, ever. There are no two people the same, no 2 days the same, no 2 seasons the same. There might be patterns, there might be similarities, but nothing ever repeats itself. So the challenge is always to play a piece like it's being born afresh. The dynamics change. Sometimes you add or take away an ornament. You might play something stronger or faster or slower, depending on an acoustic. The audience is different. The pianist is different. Everything is changing all the time. So you can't be on that one track, memorizing your notes and kind of reproducing them in the same way. I think it's like giving birth to a stillborn child. So embracing those never-ending variables is a very powerful place to be. So when you are improvising regularly, I often describe improvising. I describe it as embracing the evolving moment. That's what it feels like. It's like you're hugging something that is in constant moving. It's not like you're hugging something that's still. So you're learning how to shape your technique on a template that is in constant evolution, life. And that's why I love working on improvisation, through using improvisation as a tool to work out a way of playing that is also free and flexible and able to adapt to an evolving moment. And I think when you're playing from memory, one can either kind of stick to the script, or one can really sense each note growing out of the next, the pauses, the rests, the breaths growing in an organic way that sounds spontaneous, like you're not playing, oh, I know the next note is a G, that you're searching for the next note. So I think you understand something from improvising. You understand something about the nature of composing. You understand something about the nature of performing in a way that makes the next thing not predictable, but a revelation. So it's like learning to understand when you're asking a question, what's coming next? Or if you're giving an answer, that's another way of playing. So you don't discover that until you start to delve into the unknown. And that's why avoiding improvising is, for a musician, is like avoiding half of who you are as a player, half of your potential.
How do you use improvising in your teaching?
Whenever possible. I suppose it depends on the level of this student, but the basic principle is, whenever possible, don't rely on a book. Rely on your ears. So there comes a point where I just spontaneously ask them just to make something up. I don't tell them what key, I don't tell them fast, slow. I just say, just keep it simple. Just make something up and just keep going for a couple of minutes. But I guarantee you that if you stop after 10 seconds, you won't learn anything. But if you can keep playing for a couple of minutes, by the end of 2 minutes, you will feel comfortable. And I ask them, is 2 minutes too much to pay? And they think, well, no, it's just 2 minutes.
Mm.
And they just jump. But I've been to classes where people have been giving a class on improvisation, and they give charts of chord progressions for everyone to practice.
Mm.
And I see 20 kids in a class coming out with a blank look on their face and feeling really discouraged and like, I can't do this. So I think to give people those sequences and those charts and those chords and those, not at the beginning. If you want someone to grasp the idea and the freedom of making something up, let them start with that without setting any parameters.
Mm.
So they can actually, by the way, those 10 minutes, when I improvised for the first time, I shocked myself because what came out was Arabic.
Wow.
I had studied classical music from day one, and I never really liked Arabic singing, Kulthum, Fayrouz. I mean, they were in the background on the radio, but I never studied it. And I didn't like Kulthum because I hate the Arabic orchestras where you got 20 violins scratching away the same tune as the singer, everyone improvising at the same time. It's just a fucking mess. And I think I just didn't like it. But when I picked up the flute and I improvised for the first time, what came out was like Middle Eastern. So, and then quite often when I ask students to kind of play anything, the Irish will play something a bit Celtic, you know, and it kind of, it's like they go like a salmon goes to where it was born a little bit instinctively. And that's very, very good. Because you discover that culture is not something you learn, it's something that's quasi instinctive. And there's a very strong confidence that is born out of that. Because especially for someone like me, because basically the war tore my heart out. I mean, I'm alive and I didn't die, and we're privileged to be alive. But the scar that the war left in me, the sectarianism, the massacres, the hijacking and the torture on the basis of religion, made me want to deny anything to do with Lebanon. So I've always kind of suppressed the Lebanese in me in terms of nationality and politics and religion. But what came out of the flute was some kind of inner spontaneous yearning that I could accept. But then I've resisted going to Nai players and oud players and asking them, please teach me the Lebanese scales, the Arabic scales. I don't want that. I don't want that. I prefer to make up my own scales. So, but you know, some people say, no, what do you mean? You're not playing real Arabic music. You're just making, yes, I'm making it up. And yes, I haven't learned it the proper way. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Because actually, I feel that you can't really define what a culture is. It changes from person to person. You can't define what a nation is. Each village in Lebanon thinks it's more Lebanese than the other village. So I like that freedom. So I encourage my students to make up scales, to experiment with some quarter tones if it helps them, or to improvise in a kind of contemporary freestyle if it helps them. And they discover a process that's not only liberating musically, it's liberating because especially whenever you learn something new that you didn't think you could do, your confidence grows. That's very, very important. Um, and then with time, they develop their own style, and I don't interfere with that. So I've got no problem with letting them improvise very, very simply. Yeah.
How could teaching change when the student it has just begun? Because normally, well, a lot of the time the teacher opens a book quite soon into the process, and reading is, the main experience of learning music.
Well, sight reading is pretty useless, but there is one benefit that I can think of. Well, maybe two. One benefit is that you can become quite a flexible musician in terms of playing something quickly, sight reading, being adaptable. So if you're aiming to be a session musician or an orchestral player, you damn well do need to be able to read music. To be able to respond quickly, learn things quickly, and there's like a code you learn. And if you're part of that code, you can fit with people quite under pressurized situations, and you can produce a kind of ready-made musicality. But there's one more important thing with reading that's useful. If you can't read music, then the only way you can learn music is by hearing someone else play something and then copying them. So when you copy someone else, you, without necessarily realizing it, you're copying where they're breathing, the speed, the vibrato, the kind of sound they're using, their whole character as a musician, you're copying. If you can pick up a score and decipher it and play it, you don't have to have heard a piece played by someone else before. So you can construct something out of your own imagination. So in a way that can open many more doors for you finding your own voice. So those are the two benefits of reading music. So I think it should be encouraged. But I would encourage young players who are starting out from the outset to not rely on reading the notes, but to memorizing them. So obviously they need the notes there to decipher it in the first week or 2 weeks that they're learning something. But if they're playing a piece for 3 weeks, a month, 6 weeks, really by the end of it, they should be playing it without looking at the music. And if that takes root early, it becomes a habit without too much of a painful struggle to change. It's harder later on in life. Although I've had friends who've performed from memory for the first time in their 60s. And their minds were blown by the experience, and they feel, why didn't I try that before?
Do you think the young students can learn to play by ear?
Yes. I think that's kind of a little bit what the Suzuki method relies on, but it's a little bit too regimented and in the way it's done. But I'm a patron of the Suzuki kind of wind players here in the UK. So there's a lot I connect with, but it's a little bit too regimented and too much based on exams and copying.
Right.
And then unfortunately, when kids graduate from that and go into the mainstream, they quite often stop memorizing because they feel like they have to learn to read better. And they've been kind of felt a bit restrictive. The other good thing about the Suzuki method is that they're playing in groups, so they're listening to each other. That's healthy. but I feel it's a little bit too regimented.
Right.
I'm a real individualist in the way I look at things. It's important to get on with people, but from a strong foundation of the self.
One thing I'm always very interested in is when improvisers record themselves and listen back to their recordings. And of course, some improvisations must feel more successful than others. And sometimes you really feel like you're in the zone, and other times you maybe feel like you're struggling to find ideas. When you listen back to recordings, when you've played well, what is it that you like about what you hear?
There's something fundamentally organic about the playing. I'm not sure I understand what the word organic means, but what I think it means is that there's something absolutely primal and elemental that is happening in a way that every note is growing out of the other notes. That it cannot be but that way. Of course, it could be another way, but it had to be that way in that moment because you chose it. And sometimes we choose something and it's wrong, but we fix it and we adapt it and we make it right. So there's no giving up on the moment when you're improvising. So your mind is so focused, your emotions are so focused in the moment. The vibrato becomes not kind of generic, it becomes deeply connected to the evolving line of the music. And that's very hard to do when you're constructing a piece and stopping and starting and building a performance and building a concept kind of in your mind. You try to sound like you're improvising, but it's always kind of a little bit, it's not always second best. Sometimes we miss the moment in an improvisation because we haven't been able to rehearse, because we haven't been able to repeat. So there are benefits to memory too. But when sometimes I remember feeling really uncomfortable in the moment, improvising. But then when I listen to the recording, it doesn't sound quite as bad as I thought it did. But that happens a lot because you're not actually caught up in the playing. So you're free from the anxiety and you can just sit back and listen to the sounds without the effort of playing the sounds. And then sometimes we think, oh my God, that felt great. Hello, Puss Puss. That felt great, but then when we listen to it, it sounds really self-indulgent and kind of not really right. But then I also know that listening to recordings, one has to be in the right frame of mind. Because whatever we hear, we are hearing through the filter of our idealism, the filter of our self-judgment, our self-criticism, and that really changes the way we hear ourselves. So if you listen to the same recording on 2 different days, you might have a completely different experience. If I'm feeling tired, slightly low about my playing, I've had a bad practice day where I can't play well, and I listen to recording, I hear all the things I hate about myself. But if I have had a great day and I've flown with my flute, and I listen to the same recording recorded 10 years back, I hear all the good things I like about myself. It's the same when you look in the mirror every day. Sometimes you see someone you can't stand. Sometimes you look in the mirror and you say, yeah, I'm okay. It's all how you feel inside. It influences what you see in others and in yourself. And that's really good to know about yourself because you stop judging yourself quite so quickly. You just allow the moment just to happen.
Do you normally improvise as a soloist, or do you sometimes improvise in a duo or a trio?
Yeah, mostly as a soloist on my own, but occasionally, and actually more often now, like for instance, I have a series of 3 recitals now, titled Embracing the Evolving Moment. That's the title of the 3 recitals. So each recital has 2 big pieces. And by the way, my pianist plays from memory. So we both play from memory in the sonatas. And then in the middle, we improvise together for 5 minutes, 8 minutes, depending. And we don't discuss what we're going to do. I don't know if I'm going to start, what note we're going to start. Each time we start from the beginning. Now, there are some patterns that do evolve, and we both have our comfort zones where we're, and it tends to be meditative rather than fast. Okay, but it's very free. Yeah.
And do you both enjoy the same sorts of things when you listen back to a recording?
Probably not. Alex is a very different person to me. Very different. But I feed off that, because if we were both the same, there would be less diverse musically. He's very different to me. He's 20 years younger, and of course, he's a very good improviser. But he's coming from harmony, and I'm coming from a melody. But also character-wise, we're very different. He's a man of few words, and when he says something, he really means it. I tend to shoot off in all directions, hoping that some of the words stick. I'm getting better though with age. I'm getting a bit better, but I'm being silly. But no, it's true. I'm a bit more comfortable being extrovert. He tends to be quieter. But this quietness is a strength. It's not a weakness.
My final question would be, as you look at the music scene now, for example, in London, does it feel different to the music scene 30 years ago in terms of improvising and openness to improvising?
Oh yeah, very much so. So I was a student in the late 70s. So when I was 17, when I was at college, I was 19 when I went to college. In Manchester. That was in 1979. So the teaching in my circumstance was very kind of French school, flute playing, the studies, the technique. And there was a big band, but that was jazz. That was like, you guys are not like us. You're different. And you were either jazz or you were classical. And that's pretty much was it. If you felt classical, well, I kind of sneered at the jazz, you're sharp, or you're not really thinking of your sound. And of course, the jazzers sneered at us because we were so narrow in our tunnel vision of experimentation. But now I wouldn't say it's completely mainstream, but it's so many more people have absorbed the idea of improvisation being a really important aspect of any musician to have as part of their makeup. So I think that it has changed. I wish that, I wish there wasn't this kind of expectation that improvisation kind of means jazz. That's maybe that's because we're in Western culture. That's the first thing we see. But there are so many forms of improvisation. And I think if you go into kind of ethnic music and world music, kind of Japanese music, Indian music, Peruvian music, kind of Lebanese, Arabic music, and discover the different languages, I think it's more beneficial for us to develop different sound worlds and experimentations than going straight from trying to be a classical musician to being a jazz musician. Since anyway, jazz came from so many different ethnic backgrounds anyway. The Black music, the African music, the Caribbean music, the Latino, the mixtures of the rhythms and cultures. But if you want to be exposed to the violent contrasts and diversities that inhabit this world, if you go into the ethnic music and learn improvisation in those styles, I think it's more enlightening than necessarily going to jazz. Maybe I say that because I'm weak harmonically and I kind of resist going into improvising to a chord structure. And I noticed that jazz, like 150 years ago, was a different jazz to what's happening now. And again, it's kind of mushrooming, it's changing and evolving into so many splinter groups. But at Trinity, where I used to teach, we had a jazz department. So side by side, we'd have someone practicing Rachmaninoff, I would be playing my recital, and then in the next room, you'd have a saxophone player practicing from the jazz department. And all they were practicing were those chord progressions. They're practicing scales. And in a way, they're more entrenched than even classical musicians are sometimes. And in a way, that's not improvisation, that's memory work. So, okay, they practice all their fancy modulations, and then whatever they're playing, they just slip it in. It's like music by numbers. That's not really improvising. Not to me. To really not know what's going to come next, to try and guess what chord the pianist is going to land on, without knowing it's 1, 4, 5, 1. Repeat 20 times. For me, that's really taking a step into real improvising. For me. But I know that many people feel that's just too simplistic and some kind of harmonic rigor needs to be all present. But for me, I could not have started on that journey, my improvising journey, had I followed that path. It's interesting. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting that in the world of jazz improvisation, there is this continuum of improvisation. I mean, from a long way away, people think that jazz is improvised, and that's the end of the story. Yeah. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And some players are really on the edge and in the moment and are really improvising, let's say. And I think it's possible to say that there are plenty of players on the other end of the continuum who have practiced a lot of language and have got, I don't want to say this in a negative way. I don't mean this to sound critical, but for some reason, we all find ourselves somewhere along that continuum. We're drawn to some place on that continuum because of our personalities. And in jazz, some musicians are drawn, like say Sonny Rollins. It's like, he's known as like one of the greatest improvisers within the world of professional jazz musicians. Lee Konitz as well is somebody who's really considered to be out on the edge. And I think most jazz musicians really aspire to that condition. Pure improvisation. I mean, Keith Jarrett, I heard him play in London a few years ago with a trio. And on the one hand, it felt so authentically jazz, kind of mixture of bebop and standards. But at the same time, I couldn't hear a single thing I'd heard before. And that was so unique to have the freshness and the authenticity together. And I do think that every improviser in any player is aiming for that. Bringing these two things together. Originality sums it up. Origins and being new. So somehow original means, So I try to play jazz, and it's my goal. So sometimes I'm practicing vocabulary and trying to understand the language, hoping that when I'm in the moment, it's somehow going to find itself out, going to work itself out in a fresh way. But it doesn't always happen.
That's beautifully put. I think one of the most destructive words is the word "or," because it's like you're either this or you're that, and it negates the possibility of the word "and" is inclusive. Mm-hmm. So I tend to fall into that trap. I have to consciously remind myself to embrace both ends of that continuum that you described. It's like a pendulum.
I think it's somehow about language. Language structures our thinking and creates these continuums in our mind. We've got words at different ends of the continuum that supposedly mean completely opposite things. But yes, maybe to try not to think of lines, but I don't know, circles or something. And
yeah. Well, that's, to me, I've pitted memory and improvisation as two kind of polar ends, opposites. But I know how intertwined they are when you're doing both well. And I know that the same fear exists in both. The fear of failure, the fear of getting lost, the fear of not making it, and the resistance to both is there for a lot of players. So yeah, anything else you wanted to ask?
No, that was my last question, and I'm going to be umming and ahhing if I try and scrabble for another one. Thank you, Wissam, so much for talking.
Okay,
it's been really, really interesting.
Good luck. I look forward to listening to all the other discussions that you have.
Okay, thank you so much, Wissam. Take
Good
care.
Night, pussycat.
I'm going to strangle her now.
Okay, good night.